Thank you, Dr. Sunil. I'm just waiting for a moment or two for the presentation to upload, but in the meantime, I'll just, first of all, thank you for inviting us here today, and it's really quite a privilege for me to be here. It's been a long-term goal for me to join Ranjit here in India and just to get a sense of the fisheries and the situation on the ground. We're fortunate enough to come in a few days ago, and I've been blown away by the hospitality and the friendliness of the people in India. I'm hoping that the conversations today are going to follow that trend. We also visited some of the fisheries, and I think importantly for us, we're not going to make any promises to answer all your questions. There will inevitably be a number of challenges, and all fisheries are different. We're here to listen and to understand, but having seen the situation on the ground, it's really a good taste for me of how the fisheries operate, the sort of challenges you're coming up against. I'm joined by a number of colleagues who have been partially introduced. I'll just introduce them properly now. First of all, our regional director who oversees the outreach program for the MSC in Southern Europe and Africa, Middle East and South Asia, Edward Labar. We've got Matt Watson sitting in the middle of the room, who's come over from Australia. He's one of our senior fisheries managers, so very experienced in outreach and a good understanding of the MSC standard and how it applies to different types of fishery. And then Luan Mostert, our marketing manager for the Africa, Middle East and South Asia region as well, who's here to see how we can communicate the developments that have been happening in India. Now, I've been asked to talk about sustainability and tropical fisheries, and it's potentially a very, very big subject. I don't have time to go into the details, and I think being first on in the day, we're going to get into the actual implementation of the MSC standard in the FIP discussions throughout the day. So what I want to concentrate on is just really posing a few questions on why we're here, why we're all joining in on this journey of sustainability, what it means to be certified and what we're actually certifying, what is sustainability and what is certification, and then thirdly, how the MSC standard can be used to certify tropical fisheries. Now, tropical fisheries on their own there's certain attributes. I mean, we're very well aware that there are multiple species that tend to be caught. They have a very diverse catch profile. Other issues, maybe the speed, the growth rates, changes in environmental conditions, those sort of things can happen very quickly. And because of that, we get approached and asked about whether the MSC has a mixed fisheries standard. The short answer to that is we don't have that. There has been work going into how we can assess mixed fisheries, but it doesn't mean that tropical fisheries can't be certified against the MSC standard as it currently stands. So I want to really talk about how that happens. Firstly, just to take a step back on why we're all here, and I think individually we have our own notions of why we're involved in sustainability. I've taken this quote from our website because I think it points to a couple of things. Firstly, the world is recognizing that the systems that we've had in place over the years haven't been sufficient to deliver resource sustainability. We've seen environmental impacts, but importantly, not all the stakeholders involved have equal capacity to implement changes. Of course, if you're a fisher, you can change the way you're fishing. If you're a fisheries manager, you can put in place rules, legislation, that sort of thing to enforce change. But if you're a consumer or an exporter, you can really only rely on leverage. And this is why certification standards have found a space. This is why the MSC has been successful over the last 25 years. It's that the playing field involves stakeholders from across the board. Governments are being faced with delivering sustainable development goals. I know we're going to be talking about that tomorrow. Issues of food security and social security are important to them. For fishers, going out and fishing sustainably is about their livelihoods, ensuring that they can pass on those traditions to their children and grandchildren. And then if you're in the market, perhaps it's because there's pressure coming from lucrative markets. Maybe the consumers are wanting to know that they're buying responsibly. So we're all involved in some way, and I think that quote just really says it. Now, in terms of what the MSC delivers for you, why would we be MSC certified? At the heart of it, it's simply an independent view of what you're doing. Is what you're doing delivering on what the world understands sustainability to be? Now, important to recognize in that is that MSC isn't a small group of people sitting in an office deciding what sustainability looks like. The standard is based on UN guidelines. It comes about through very wide stakeholder consultation that takes viewpoints from right across the spectrum, from NGOs, academics, management authorities, fishers themselves, to try and identify what we mean by sustainability. So the measures that we have in place really reflect where we want to get to. It's a pathway framework that can be used by different sectors of the fishery supply chain in different ways. Potentially there's an enhanced reputation. I think importantly, it brings people together. And I just want to focus on that third bullet point because that's what we're doing today. One of the big benefits of programs like ours is that we bring those people together to talk to each other. And I really hope that's going to be a focus of the day. Now, just to look at tropical fisheries, and I've included this slide just to demonstrate, as I'm sure you're all aware, fisheries operate in very, very different ways around the world. We use different gears, we target different species, different size fisheries, of course. What all of these have in common, and the reason I've included it, is that almost all fisheries catch more than what they're targeting. There's normally bycatch or non-targeted other catch. So while tropical fisheries do have a very broad catch profile, there are ways to deal with this. In the MSC, the first thing that we will do, or not we, the certifiers, will do is sit with the potential client group and identify what it is that is going to be certified. Because ultimately, when we talk about certifying a fishery, it's about an end product making a claim. So for the consumer buying something, they want to know that product comes from a responsible fishery. So the first thing we need to do is define what we mean by fishery, what it is that we're claiming against, and it's very, very few fisheries that are in the MSC program can claim certification against all the species that they catch. Normally, there is demand from the market for key target species, the higher value species. So potentially the shrimp trawl, for instance, there'll be 5 or 10 species that the fishers are trying to catch. Those are the ones that the market is demanding, and those are what you're trying to certify. So what this slide shows is just a mixed assemblage of species being fished in different ways. They would normally define a unit of assessment and a unit of certification. In one operation, you can have multiple units of assessment. So you may decide that your target species is X, or you've got 3 target species, X, Y, and Z. They're all being caught by trawl, and it's in the Carolyn waters. So you would have a unit of assessment being species A, trawl caught in those waters, a second unit of assessment, species B, and so forth. So you can split an operation into a number of different units of assessment, and within that, the part that would be certified would be those belonging to the client group. It may be a subset of vessels. It could be that you've included different gears and you've split it out into only one gear that's certified. So there are different ways to slice and dice and set up what the certification is. Now, that's quite important, I think, in the context of tropical fisheries, simply because you do tend to have lots of different species. And if you're wanting to certify and claim against a whole fishery, all the catch coming out, you would necessarily need to identify all the species, whether that's 100 species, 200 species, and set them up as individual units of assessment, which is not going to be practical in almost all cases. But we tend to deal with it. I'll get to a few slides on how we deal with those other species that are not the focus of the unit of assessment. The reason we set it up like this, and I must apologize, some of these slides come from, they're older slides, they should be updated, but I don't have the updated graphics for them yet. The principles remain the same. Our definition of sustainability, and remembering that this means the broader definition across stakeholder groups is that the species that we're claiming against comes from a healthy population, that the environment that they exist in is in a healthy state and being maintained in a healthy enough state to support that population, and that there are management systems in place that can ensure we can respond to change. So really it's very difficult to find shortcuts to manage groups of species together, which is why we set up in this way. What we do for the species that are not the target is that they are split out into, and again, this is on version 2.01. There are some changes which I'll just touch on in a minute, but we would normally identify if they're endangered, threatened, and protected species, whether there are out-of-scope species, and then for the in-scope species, so the fishes and crustaceans that can or could be certified but are not the target, we then need to categorize them into main and minor, depending on the levels of catch. At this stage, many of the tropical fisheries are actually at a bit of an advantage because the thresholds that are set in the MSC standard, if a species is in the catch at levels greater than 5% by volume, it gets classified as a main. And I'm going to simplify this because it has been simplified in the latest version of the standard. If it's a less resilient species, it would be above 2%, and below 2% species are normally considered minor unless the fishery is of a very large capacity. So main and minor species are treated under the second principle that I talked about in the previous slide, the environmental impacts of the fishing operation. They are subjected to management requirements, but not to the same level that the target species is subjected. So the species A that you've set up the unit of assessment around has to have management in place to achieve a level around what we call maximum sustainable yield. For the bycatch species, non-targeted species, whatever your term is, low value species, they don't need to achieve maximum sustainable yield. There's a lower threshold called point of recruitment impairment, and this is what the assessors are looking for. So it's not necessary to have dedicated stock assessments, for instance, for across all species that are being caught in the fishery. And it's very important to recognize that and to be able to set up your FIP action plans in line with what is necessary to pass certification, bearing in mind what you're ultimately trying to claim. Of course, there are examples of where more information is required. In these cases, we do recognize that many well-managed fisheries around the world don't have sufficient data necessarily to do stock assessments, and they don't necessarily need to. There are ways to manage fisheries on a risk-based approach, and we have tools in place for that. We've got something called the risk-based framework that uses it's basically based on the available data, and the assessors will convene stakeholders to get inputs on those different species to basically apply various analyses and proxies. Not going into any of the detail in that, we can talk about it further if anyone's interested, but there are 4 tests that use available data. They assess the resilience of species. Generally, they use proxies, that sort of thing, to come up. I've got a question.
Can we go back to the previous slide, please?
Yeah.
Want to get a proper understanding. You say if it's more than 5%, then it becomes a primary targeted fishery.
The main species, yeah.
Which means 95% becomes bycatch? If you
No. So in the assessment, you've got a targeted catch, and that's what we would call P1, the principal 1 species. For everything else, they still sit in principle 2, but if it's above 5% by volume, there are more rigorous management and outcome requirements than for species that are caught in very low volumes and potentially negligible impact by that fishery. So there would be a higher level of management expected but it's not considered target species. It's still not expected to be around MSY. It's still the point of recruitment and payment.
Because in geographies where we are going to open it more. In our case, one fishing boat in a 24-hour cycle, we catch 3 or 4 different species.
Mhm.
While one big species is predominant in a particular trawl, maybe a day trawl and a night trawl. So how does that, what is considered to be 5% per trawl in a net, or what that boat brings to the shore?
Look, that would need to probably be determined up front by the assessors when they're setting up, when they're deciding what the fishery is, but I would imagine normally it's when you bring it to shore. But in those cases, you've got your 4 or 5 different species that you would probably want to set up as targeted species as 4 different units of assessment. So you would treat each one, they would assess each of those as a principal 1 species, and when species X is principal 1, Y and Z come under principal 2, they're more than 5%, and then same when you do species Y, then X and Z go under principle 2. So they would score the separate units of assessment, assuming you wanted all those certified. Okay. Does it make sense? I don't know if I've answered that clearly.
For me, it creates a bigger problem because our standard distribution is about 20% each of the different type of species that are landed. It's very rare that you see that, like in, say for example in case of Alaska pollock, where 95 or 96% is Alaska pollock and 2-3% is halibut. That never happens here, unless it's, for example, a purseiner. But in trawl, you will have 4, 5, 6 different species, more or less in equal quantities. Sometimes there could be in beginning of the season, maybe a threadfin bream is 50%, but everything else is about 10, 15, 20% in terms of distribution. So when we are looking at certifying threadfin bream as a species, this particular flow diagram creates a problem which necessarily requires us to also look at everything else that comes along.
So in all fisheries, all the species that are caught need to be listed and looked at. But I don't think it creates